My question is around the kind of the parental rights piece of this. When a child in crisis, whichever reason, in this bill, there's two reasons, right? That they could be going to, let's say, a shelter, and then the parents aren't notified. Parents, ruled multiple times by the Supreme Court, have the right to parent. Washington v. Glucksberg. There's at least 7 or 8 different Supreme Court rulings that say parents have the right and ability to not only care for their children, but also bring them up and raise them in multiple other ways as well. So my question to you is, how do you see that this bill escapes those constitutional challenges around the due process part of the 14th Amendment that gives parents those rights?
Is that a question for me? Well, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I will say that the state intervenes in lots of different circumstances in the relationship between a parent and child when the child is being done harm, and I think this is one of those circumstances.
All three of you have used the words supportive or affirming repeatedly in your testimony, and even said that the lack of affirmation is harm. How is the lack of affirmation harm, and in what sense is the lack of affirmation harm?
Thank you. Well, thank you for that question, Representative Walsh. I think as LGBTQ folks up here, what we know is that oftentimes when you don't have a supportive home environment as an LGBT person, that can lead to other behavioral health issues. And we have other statistics, such as 40% of homeless youth are LGBT, or nearly 50% of trans or non-binary folks attempting suicide. We think about ways to address, to lower those barriers. And when you have people supporting someone's gender identity or sexual orientation, when they don't have that at home, we try to find other ways to build community around that young person to reduce those factors.
Follow up?
Appreciate that. That's not really my point. The point of my question is, affirmation seems to be a rather subjective and high standard of expectation from a family. It is possible to love a person and not affirm everything they're doing. So how do we apply that high standard of affirmation to the law, to public policy, especially if we're going to restrict parental involvement in a child's life?
Well, I think a big piece of that is when they don't have the supportive home environment. Part of the host-home situation and what gender-affirming care is that wraparound around that child, so that ideally, if there's a way to build that barrier back with their the caregivers, with their families, there is a bridge to do that. And so, because what we know is that when we surround children, especially LGBTQ youth, with supportive and affirming environments, the risk factors for them attempting suicide and other behavioral health issues and homelessness all go down.
Would you agree that the ultimate goal would be to reunify these kids with their parents?
I would agree that a child is always going to be better off in a healthy family environment, yes.
You're all shaking your head, yes. Follow up?
Follow up?
So would you also agree that to notify the parent so that they know where the child is, and to include counseling services immediately for the whole family would be an ultimate goal here?
So I think in the best of situations, that would be wonderful. Part of the idea behind this bill is that it is unsafe for parents to sometimes know where their kids are. If they're in a state where just by knowing where their child is, they could be prosecuted in their home states. So that's part of the idea behind this bill. And also, it is not always safe for that to be an immediate thing. Sometimes that time for that kid to be able to take the time and get the behavioral health services that are necessary allows them to approach it in a safe and more comfortable way for the family to all sit down and have that conversation.
Ma'am, in that same vein, part of the intent of this bill is to try to curb or maybe even stop trans suicides, which is a goal I think probably all of us share or should share. Certainly I do. To me, and I'm wondering if you agree, isn't having some kind of supportive family structure from the beginning for those youth in crisis, isn't that one of the best ways that we can curb those transgender suicide rates?
That also can take scaffolding. That doesn't necessarily, there are steps to that. And often it takes a team of individuals to help stabilize a young person and their family and reunify. So it's not an either or. It's often a very complicated, these circumstances are often complicated and compounded by trauma. They're compounded by access to the care that maybe a youth has been trying to receive but then has been denied by their family structure. And so there isn't a flipping of a switch. It takes time, and and as a parent myself, I had to become educated and better informed on what is best for my child, and I rely on medical professionals to be able to help guide me in my parenting and my husband in our parenting of our young person. So nothing about accessing gender affirming care and affirming resources and support systems. It's not like you're picking something off the shelf. It's highly individualized, and there are individual circumstances that come along that where people need to be met where they are at to then further them to a more stable environment and life.
May I add something? Representative Couture, and I think this goes to your question as well, Representative Eslick, is just reminding everybody that these youth have often, or I think a former witness said it, that youth don't take becoming houseless, becoming unsheltered lightly. So if the youth we're talking about got into the situation of accessing a homeless youth shelter or a host home, they did not take that decision lightly. That means something's going on at home that really forced them into a desperate situation, and I think we have to frame it within that context. Just wanted to note that.
Sir, while I was listening to your testimony, I was considering if it were one of your kids that was in crisis of some kind for one of these two reasons, and they ran away to a shelter, would you rather prefer that you were notified as a parent right away where your kid was so you knew where they were at and they were safe, and that then the state would provide counseling services to both you and your kids as a family? Would you rather prefer something like that?
I would prefer to know where my kid was as soon as they are somewhere. I think every parent, especially if it's a younger child, if it's an 11 or 12-year-old girl or boy who decides, I can't hack it here, I'm leaving, and they go somewhere else. Maybe they're in another state, maybe they're in an institution, maybe they're with another family nearby. I think a parent has a right to know where their kids are. I think we have an absolute right to know where our kids are. I think in a situation where a parent is abusive and a child needs to run from abuse, then there's situations where we need to protect those children by not letting the parents know where they are. I don't think not agreeing with them is abuse.